I'm not,
It's so
no.
stupid, I didn't do like 300
Oh, really?
images, and like 15 of them are taken.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so a couple of reminders. So got this creative project proposal. Some of you got that submitted. Thank you for working early. Otherwise, due Saturday night, and I've got an availability window for Sunday. So pretty much just this weekend. Not looking for much. Just one, maybe 2 pages. Give it a 1, that's fine. There is a rubric on Canvas. So if you go to the site for the creative project proposal on Canvas, there's a list of all the expectations there. Basically tell me what kind of principle you're hoping to demonstrate, how you're going to do that, and then how are you going to capture that in a digital format that your peers can review in the last week of classes when we do the peer reviews for these things. So they're kind of the key things, but just follow the rubric there, and that should take care of that. And I will give you feedback on whether I think, oh, this is maybe a little too ambitious, or this doesn't really capture this well, or it looks good. And I anticipate that in both cases, I'm just going to say this sounds great, but it's my opportunity to sort of say, well, maybe try something a little less, or maybe dial out these elements and so on. Otherwise, standard muddiest point. And then next week, we just have the Mitchell reading, which is pretty simple reading, kind of some background on evolution. And that will end up sort of tying into some of the things that we've been talking about this week. So it should dovetail pretty well. So any questions? Okay. All right, I did notice in looking through the both kind of the muddiest point comments and as well as the comments during Zoom night on the reading, on the perusal, I wanted to make a distinction about some of the things we did when we talked about closed systems in the second law and what we're talking about now, which are really open systems. And so we still talk about multi-scale modeling. And so there is a such thing as sort of a macro scale and a micro scale. So, when we talk about multi-scale modeling, this occurs regardless of what we're talking about, whether we're talking about open systems or closed systems. So we frequently will use terms like micro scale or micro state, and we might refer to macro scale or macro state. And so these are sort of, this is just generally an approach to say that when I'm drawing the boundaries of my system, am I zooming in on something which occurs at relatively small spatial scales or relatively small temporal scales? And so that's kind of what we refer to as sort of the micro scale. And we refer to it as micro scale because if we were to sort of model every single individual in the United States at the level of the United States, it would be very, very difficult to build that model because it would be very big. And so we might model what happens in between a couple of individuals, and and that is a reasonable thing to say, well, that's a social interaction. So like in economics, we might imagine what happens in a particular market transaction, and that way we think about individuals. But when we zoom out to the level of the whole United States, we then model variables at a different scale. So that's what we mean by macro scale. So at that point, we say, I don't actually care what each individual is doing, but I care about how many transactions are going on in an area, or how much money in general is trading hands at any particular instant of time. That's looking by going from micro to macro. Now, I think the confusion sometimes comes to part is that before we were talking about closed systems. And so these are systems that you have no work is being done on them. Or in other words, no energy is being added. And in these systems, basically, we assume that if we want to describe the system as a whole, if no work is being done on them, then our best guess as to what's happening is just whatever randomness would give us. And so randomness is kind of the governing process. Randomness governs dynamics. And under this assumption, then we got the second law, thermodynamics, being a useful tool. And that basically just said that we move toward more probable macro states. This is just all stuff we were doing, before the exam. And by more probable, that's a more, I'll try to erase that and make that a little bit more readable. Apologies for the writing angle. And so, and then we quantify that by multiplicity. So if a macrostate, which is just a property of a microstate, had a lot of microstates that have that property, it was pretty probable, and vice versa. And so the thought was there is if we're moving from microstate to microstate randomly, then the macrostates we're going to be in are the ones that have the most microstates in them. And that's all the second law says. But that's just kind of when you're sitting near equilibrium, you're not adding any energy to systems, you're seeing what patterns kind of evolve naturally. Now, what we've moved into in this unit are open systems. So work or energy is being added. And that's like a fuel which allows systems to organize in non-trivial ways. Or otherwise self-organization. In other words, we're really talking about, if I'm going to link it back to, if I want closed systems, I said if we break apart a closed system, there can be, there can be local decreases in entropy in those closed systems. Overall, the closed system is moving towards more probable macrostates, but at little bubbles, subsystems inside the closed system, we can kind of view work being done on those. And that creates these structures. So, we talk about dissipative structures. Which were like hurricanes, but also life itself. And so before the midterm, we were saying, well, if we want to zoom out and just think about a system that we can view as kind of closed, and what's kind of the null hypothesis, then we can use the second law of thermodynamics. That's where that econophysics sort of stuff came into play. If people are just trading money, no money is being added, there's no governmental force being pushed down upon it, then what would you expect over time a money distribution to be like? And we'd say, well, if it went to the highest entropy, just randomness would cause it to have that exponential distribution. And so if you want something other than the exponential distribution, you have to do work on the system. You have to have governmental policies which redistribute wealth in particular ways, maybe toward a small set of people, or maybe back toward a larger group of people to sort of change that out. But the default you get from entropy maximization is that exponential. And then but that again was kind of a null hypothesis. If you did nothing, what would you just get for free from random interactions? But now what we're talking about here, and this is where it's kind of confusing, I know, because we talked about panarchy and all these different scales and whatever, and we just spent all this time talking about microstates and macrostates. And but I don't want you to think that the macro scale dynamics here are just being driven by the second law. So I think I saw in some of your comments trying to find an interpretation where you're saying that how does this adaptive cycle, how is it predicted by the second law? And and it's not meant to be. And so the thought here isn't that the second law is driving things to more probable macro states, and that's what's generating this lack of diversity. The thought is what if we're zooming in and we're looking at the hurricane and we're saying, why does the hurricane look the way it does? Why does a hurricane start with something small and build up into this structure and hang around for a while and then just disappear? The hurricane can be described in terms of an adaptive cycle. A dissipative structure can be thought of as in forms of an adaptive cycle. Life, generally, things that have energy being added to them have the ability to organize. And what all this adaptive cycle business is about is trying to understand those out of equilibrium, that non-trivial interactions. How are they going to organize themselves? When things were just closed and we didn't have to worry about energy being added, we could just use probability and say, what's most likely? Here, when things are open, there's fuel that's constantly being powering these things. And that means that we can't just count on probability governing their dynamics. And that's what we're trying to say is that, okay, so if they have the ability to organize, how are they going to organize? And what this adaptive cycle business that sort of started out for people like C.S. Hawley came from was saying that in most of these systems, they tend to go through these 4 phases when they're given the opportunity to organize. They initially don't have many connections, and so they diversify independently. As they grow and grow and grow, they start building connections with each other. As they become constrained, those connections become important and they start regulating their connections with each other to try to get as much of this constrained resource as possible. And then eventually they become so independent and linked to each other that if another scale system comes in and upsets them, they're very frail and brittle and they break down and the whole process starts over again. And the only reason it starts over again is because there's still energy in the system letting it go. You know, you get one hurricane eventually dissipates, but then later on another one comes up because there's still energy being added to the system. So these are out of equilibrium structures. They're not sort of described by the second law. I mean, in the end, everything's, you know, the universe is described by the second law, but when we zoom in on just one little area that has energy coming into it, then that local area has the ability to do things which seem to defy the second law. And that's why we need other theory to try to understand them. And the adaptive cycle is one of those theories. So I saw a tension there where I feel like in a lot of your comments, there was sort of I thought it was great to see you trying to work through, like it shows me that this resonated, that this idea that things move towards more common macro states. That's great. Use that, you're not wrong. But just remember that only holds in closed systems where nothing else is coming in from the outside. Once you have fuel coming in from the outside, then that means that structures on the inside can actually reinforce rare states. So a rare state will have enough fuel to keep itself from dissipating away like it might if it was closed. So does that make sense? The distinction between the dynamics we saw in the second law and some of the stuff we're seeing now, the adaptive cycle. The adaptive cycle is meant to be a non-equilibrium, open system thing, and the second law is meant to be kind of a more equilibrium, closed system thing. What you kind of get for free if things are just randomly moving around without any injection of energy. What you get when you can add energy and things can start organizing themselves. All right. So let's see. And I also wanted to give, we talked about the adaptive cycle last time. I wanted to give a couple of examples that I thought might be helpful. Sort of think about where, I mean, they gave examples in the text, but you know, we talked, you know, the adaptive cycle's got this R phase. So what happens during the R phase? Anybody? What was that? So what did you say? Rapid growth. I'll just call it growth for short, but rapid growth, exploitation. You know, our phase here, we maximize our rate of growth. You know, no constraints. And we have increases in diversity. And you know, we've mentioned ecological examples, but we can also think of examples from business and things like that. When Google first came about, so I'll say like early Google here, then employees at Google were actually allowed to spend certain fractions of their time doing whatever side project they wanted. And so early Google would actually produce a wide range of projects. It wasn't just search. They had products for, you know, tracking health, exercise, you know, these tiny little things, little additions to Gmail that don't exist anymore. They had a bunch of these little things that they just asked people just to go and develop stuff. And this huge portfolio turned into a bunch of these products. Many of them didn't go anywhere. Many of them only appealed to a very small number of people, but they were okay with that. And so, you know, this is like a diverse product line. And what that did is it fueled growth in the company, because whereas some of these products would catch the attention of a lot of potential customers, other ones wouldn't, but they wouldn't know which one would sort of be most successful. And so they just maintained this huge portfolio. Some of them grew rapidly, other ones didn't, and that was okay with them. And that's an example of a single corporation going through a growth phase. We can also think, just in general, you know, in venture capital, you know, or Silicon Valley, we see this a lot with individual companies. So at the scale, not so, when we talk about a scale of one company like Google, we're now Alphabet, but then we also have the scale of multiple companies. And so initially, you might see a tech sector start, and there's just a bunch of people trying to make use of a new resource. So, you know, when cell phones became something you could count on as being in everyone's pockets or purses, then those, you know, then suddenly there was an app. So there was an app for everything. You know, that was the joke. There's an app for that, right? And so that was, you know, a diverse set of companies just wanted to come out and say, we think there's there are people out there that would want this. Nobody was worried about competition with each other. They just were worried about getting their app out and getting it advertised, and then worrying about the competition later. So limitations, money limitations, the venture capital in general, nobody even worried about profitability usually at these stages. They say profitability will come later. There is money available, let's just use that money and get things off the ground. And that's an example of, at two different scales, the R phase kind of showing up. And of course, these scales interact with each other. And that's sort of where this panarchy comes into play. So then, you know, then we've got after the R phase. So these are what I would call R strategists. Sort of a common term for it, and the book uses that as well. All right, so then we have the K phase. What's the key word that we associate with the K phase? Conservation, right. So this is all about limitations kicking in. And there is now pressure for efficiency. And so constraints are focal. So as Google got bigger, they realized that in order for them to start turning a profit, they had to focus on the little sub-businesses they had that were doing really well. And they had to change their investment strategy, and they started shedding a bunch of these products. You know, you might have had a product for They used to have a product for RSS feeds and, like I said, healthcare management, some other things like that. They got rid of all of that. And they focused on a few small products. Nowadays, if you're young enough, you probably don't remember the last new product that Google brought out. Because they aren't a company that is now known to bring out new products. They're largely a company that maintains behemoth search and mail and maybe some office productivity sort of thing. So, like when once upon a time, Google Docs wasn't a thing. And now, like, it's just kind of an enterprise solution that they have available. So, so this is kind of like late Google. And it's a few profitable products. And I think it's been a while since I've talked to some of the new hire at Google. I think they're still offered, you get a certain amount of time that you can use to produce something, but now there's like there's a condition that says so long as certain other milestones are met or something like that. So basically, I think that that even though on paper they technically could have the ability to develop new products and things, that most employees are pretty much spend all of their time just maintaining these old products. And so and then likewise for these, as industries come up, then eventually someone needs them to be profitable, and those that are not profitable just disappear. And so efficiency really becomes the name of the game. And that can create risks if your whole company, like if you've now got a company that's based entirely on apps and not web and app together, if for some reason phones go away, or let's say, they say now that Gen Z now pretty much is, there's very little attractiveness of Android phones in Gen Z relative to previous generations. And so, that could be a major problem for those who are dependent upon having access to Android app stores. So if you've never diversified and brought yourself into the iOS ecosystem, then you might be left behind, and that could become a major problem, even though you've been previously super profitable in this K phase. So that brings up this idea that came up of the late K phase, where there is a focus on very few functions, and there's high vulnerability. Shock. And so I would point out, and this is that, like in Google's case, Google was once known as the leader in artificial intelligence, and then ChatGPT comes up, and suddenly the Googles, the Microsofts of the world look like they were like way behind the times. And so now they're all racing to catch up. Microsoft bought ChatGPT. Google's developing its own through Bard. There's a bunch of others that are being developed as sort of Me Too chatbots, effectively, because they didn't anticipate these, even though they were working in large language models for search, they didn't anticipate OpenAI being able to do what it did. And that has been a major shock to their system, and that's causing them to totally restructure. Facebook, for example, put all of its money on the metaverse, and now I don't think, there's still plenty of people putting on 3D goggles and whatever, but I think Mark Zuckerberg was really banking on a future where everyone was walking around in augmented reality, and that just doesn't seem to be the case. So it really makes them vulnerable because they're sort of counting on only one sort of function to keep them for survival, and if that one function doesn't pan out, then they end up collapsing. And so that's what brings us to the omega phase, which is release. And it's basically a shock, causes systems to break apart. and resources held up are now available. And that will bring us to the alpha phase, or reorganization or renewal. Where you can say chaos of omega phase leads to new players who use available resources in new ways. And that's it, that's the adaptive cycle. And the thought here was, just like in the second law of thermodynamics, we're looking for something we could count on when things are just bouncing around randomly. And this idea that observable macro states that were more probable would be the thing that we likely see the world taking, see the closed systems of the world kind of converging to. Then this is the idea that Hulling kind of realized, is that when there's opportunity for growth, there will be growth. But growth necessarily can't go on forever. And that's going to eventually push up against constraints. When there are constraints, there's going to be a pressure for efficiency. And when there's a pressure for efficiency, that's necessarily going to start taking players out and reducing diversity. And with reduced diversity, there's increased vulnerability. And increased vulnerability, eventually you're going to get an external shock, either from another cycle, like a panarchy happening. There could be this for loop and back loop happening at one level. There's also for loops and back loops happening at different scales, and they interface with each other. And so you can get shocks to the system that come from dynamics at a higher scale, for example. But you can also get random shocks, like, which are, I'd ask you a question, I'll get you in just a second, which are like, if an asteroid or something like that hits the Earth, that's a shock to the system. And if you think about it in the big scheme of things, that is kind of like, a very, very, very large, system that we normally would assume is not playing a role in our lives, as we just kind of assume it's being constant. But in reality, it can still go through its own dynamics and throw in things at us that we haven't modeled. And those can be these shocks that cause this system to fail. And that's sort of this idea of panarchy. And that sort of is this idea of we're constantly going to be cycling through growth and collapse. Growth within systems, collapse facilitated by interaction between systems. Question?
Yeah, my question was just like, I sort of was confused on what panarchy meant, but you just explained it. So.
Okay. Yeah, and so we can think of, this could be the company scale. This could be the market sector. This could be the whole economy. So we can see, how many people have heard of the Silicon Valley Bank and the collapse? Okay, so, Silicon Valley Bank is one example of one bank that was arguably, I think the reasons for the collapse are complex, and I'm not an expert in this, but I think that if we talk to a domain expert in it, we can see that there was a focus on particular assets at the bank that didn't pan out. So a hyper focus on efficiency, they went into their late K phase, they collapsed. And so it was a collapse at a small scale here. If we think back to subprime mortgages, when a bunch of banks collapsed all at once, then that was an example in history where at the scale of the company, if you got a bunch of synchronized collapse, that corresponds to a collapse of a whole banking market. But banking is so important in the economy that it led to collapses in other parts of the economy. But as I hope you saw in this chapter and in the previous chapter, there can be collapses at the local scale, that if they happen sort of independently, then they provide an opportunity for renewal here, which somehow allows the larger scales to kind of move backwards in their adaptive cycles. So instead of racing toward being more and more vulnerable, if you can get small scale collapses that don't happen all at once, then you can actually maybe make higher scales less vulnerable. And so maybe the resources that are freed up by this bank allow other banks to then diversify in ways that they weren't able to because the resources used to be held by one bank that wasn't quite as diverse. So sometimes we have to allow smaller scales to collapse in order to reduce the danger of collapse at larger scales. But likewise, you could have, if the whole economy collapsed, regardless of how well your market sector was doing or your company was doing, you could also have these shocks come down this way, where suddenly money isn't available from banks and you really need to take out a loan in order to keep your company going or something like that. So you can get shocks kind of in either direction here. And sometimes it's actually good to have releases at smaller scales. They'll sort of hold off or make less painful the eventual releases at larger scales. But I do want to stress that, and this is sort of the idea that Holling sort of put forward here, is that collapse or release is inevitable. And sustainability, I'll say susty, is about surviving collapse. So as sustainability scientists, it's not our goal to try to find ways to keep life going, human life going exactly as it is for eras and eras into the future. We have to recognize that as we grow, we eventually are going to push up against different constraints. Those constraints are going to push us to become more efficient and more vulnerable to things, and with increased vulnerability, collapse is going to happen. So we either can make the eventual collapse less painful, and maybe this goes along with it, or we can find other ways to restructure to hopefully make it so we don't have to have that collapse for as soon. So they mentioned in the last chapter, if you think about renewable energy, you could wait until oil runs out. So there's just no more oil, or it's not feasible to use oil anymore. And then you can just wait for a collapse in the market sector and have everyone have to shift overnight to a new form of energy. That is one approach. Or you could you could incentivize individual companies to go through the costly process of diversifying their portfolios. And that's going to hurt at the individual levels, which is why you might need government subsidies or something like that. But if you have more diversity down here, across enough companies, you have more diversity up here. So if you then have to get rid of oil someday, then it's not going to be so much of a shock. The conflict that's going on in Ukraine, everyone was sort of expecting, well, suddenly when that Russian oil wouldn't be available, that would be a major shock. And it was. I think everyone was surprised at how quickly prices sort of actually came back down to levels very similar to where they were before. So that shows that there's actually was more resilience in the system than we expected, more ability, more diversity, so that single source didn't kind of cause those problems. So that's kind of what Holling's message was here, is that these shocks are going to happen, and we necessarily are going to be more and more vulnerable as we go forward, because that's what happens when you push up against constraints. You have to become more efficient. As you become more efficient, you necessarily will become more vulnerable. That increase in vulnerability is going to mean that you'll be more likely to see these shocks. It is not our job to eliminate vulnerability, because that's impossible, because the only way you can eliminate vulnerability is to have infinite resources. So as long as you have finite resources, you will eventually push up against vulnerability. And it is our job as sustainability scientists to manage vulnerability, not to eliminate it. Yes.
So that's kind of like on the Pareto frontier. You could say like one axis would be vulnerability, one would be efficiency. And it's like in order to be more efficient, then you surrender more vulnerability.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. So there was a trade-off or cost of resilience. Can somebody remember from the chapter? They talked about there is a cost of resilience. What is that cost? Yeah, go ahead.
Short-term profits.
Yeah, so the cost of resilience is often in short-term profits. So when we're making sustainability decisions, we often have to balance the cost of a crisis in the future. So there could be, so if we're thinking about, a balance here, this fulcrum, we've got a future, we'll say cost of future crisis here. That's sitting on that side. And then we also have here losses in short-term profits. And that's sitting over here on the teeter totter. And our job as sustainability scientists is to figure out where to put the fulcrum, how to balance these two. And so when you think about the cost of future crisis, this has two things that we have to keep in mind. For one, what's the probability of a crisis? And how far in the future? And so this is the time value of money. So it might be that it is $1 million cost to the company, but if it happens 100 years in the future, if you think about the interest rates on that, then that cost you can calculate the present value of that cost, and it might actually be a relatively small cost today, even though it's a large cost later. And so spending a lot of money to prevent that way in the future may not actually make economic sense. And that's perfectly reasonable. We have to make this balance. We have to decide, but as we get, this probability of the crisis, this can change over time. And of course, as we get closer to it, this can change over time. And so where you balance this is also going to, change. So if, as you get closer and closer to the crisis, you might become more conservative about how you balance these things out. But I put this up here because whenever you see a trade-off, you can think of this sort of Pareto perspective that was just brought up there. So you can say that I've got two objectives. I want to here say I want I would like my short-term profits. That would be great if they were large, but then I would also like my long-term losses. So maybe what I'm going to do here is I'm going to draw this in a funny way. I'm going to flip this around so that the axis goes the other way. So I'd like my short-term profits to be all the way on the right. But if this is 0 and these are negatives, I would like my long-term losses. Well, I don't know if we'll spell negatives, but I would like my long-term losses to be as small as possible, but I would like my short-term profits to be as large as possible. And there are a bunch of strategies that I can take right now in my company, investments I can make. And some of those investments are going to maximize my short-term profits. Other investments are going to minimize my long-term losses. So it could be, so these are things that maximize my short-term profits. These are things that minimize my long-term losses. And ideally, so you can imagine there's things all over this space, but in reality, it might be that only there's like anything. I can only do things on this side of the line. Like it might be that these are impossible. So in other words, it's impossible to have huge short-term profits and low long-term losses. If I want my short-term profits to be over here, I necessarily going to have long-term losses down here. And so you can draw a Pareto frontier. So basically any trade-off you can depict as a Pareto frontier. And then your job as someone managing that trade-off is trying to find solutions that are on the frontier. So ideally, you would like solutions that are here, because if you had a solution that was back, here, for example, then that implies that there are other ways. There are ways that you can actually make your short-term profits better and your long-term losses less. But once you're up here, then you're on this teeter-totter. And really, you need to decide whether you want to be on this side of the line or this side of the line. And whether you're on this side of the line or this side of the line, you've got to make that up based on your own priorities. But there is that trade-off there. And I can't tell you that you should always prioritize long-term losses over here, or long-term losses, I guess, here. The reason you're in business, so the reason we're doing anything is in part for the benefits we get today. And sometimes it's worth tolerating risk in the future if we get benefits today. And so you're going to be somewhere in the middle. And that's sort of, this whole perspective is very SOS 325-y. So if you're interested in this type of thinking, then I definitely encourage you to take a look at 325. But in general, I'm glad you brought that up, is that whenever you see trade-off, if you like this Pareto perspective, you should be able to draw a Pareto frontier which captures this idea of the trade. All right, so great comment. So any questions about any of that? Where do we leave off here? Just talking about, it's inevitable and everything. I just want to make sure that we've covered all of the things that I wanted us to cover last time. Yeah. All right, so this really was in part a review of these terms we've seen before. This chapter of reading: resilience, adaptability, and transformability. And also a review of kind of resilience. And so like the second reading, they introduced some terms which I thought were nice to describe the ball and basin model. So they reintroduced the ball and basin models. And they said, when we're talking about these ball and basin models, so we'll put the ball here, we can associate terms to the kind of properties of these things. So I'll draw kind of what my perspective of this is. So if I've got a ball and basin model, and I've got these three properties here, does anybody remember the term that they gave for sort of the width of a single basin? So I'm going to call this here is a stability regime, which they also call basin of attraction, which is another common term. where the alternative stable state is this thing down here. So that's the alternative stable state. So if there were no noise or anything in the system, a system in this basin would settle down to that bottom thing there. So that's like clear water, and maybe over here, like maybe this is clear water, this is murky water, this is acid-filled water, or something like that. So there are these three alternative stable states, and these are the set of initial conditions that over time will come to that stable state. So, so they gave you terms for effectively the width of this thing, the depth or slope of this thing, and as well as the distance from a system's current state to the edge. So does anybody remember what the terms were for the width of this? Yeah.
Latitude.
Latitude, that's the one that they used there. Thanks for that. So call this latitude. What about the depth? Yeah. Resistance. Resistance. So this is all we're talking about properties of resilience, but the depth of this thing is resistance. We'll say depth or slope. And then what about the last one of this picture? So this thing here, yeah.
Precariousness, but I have a question for resistance. Is it the absolute depth or is it the length along the like the edge?
Yeah, I think good question. So I mean, so these are somewhat qualitative. They're meant to sort of help provide a conceptual model. What they're trying to capture with resistance is the difficulty it would take to move the system from one point to another. So they said it's the depth, but they also talked about how a deep one will also have a steeper slope. So they kind of go hand in hand together. It's this idea that I mean, you could have a basin that maybe looked very shallow and very deep, but still the idea there would be that if it's not quite, it's like if you have one basin that's very deep and another basin that's not so deep, the idea is that if you had to put energy to move the system over, it would take more energy to move it from this basin to this basin than the other way around. So I would associate it with both kind of depth and kind of steepness of that, because the steepness is sort of the amount of how much energy it takes to move it a little bit, and the depth is how much energy it takes to move it a lot. So in general, the resistance is how much energy it takes to move it. And then precariousness, which is how close you already are to that threshold. And they pointed out that these three things, for one, sometimes they're difficult to define in a system. Even in a system where they're easy to define, there's often very times difficult to measure. So there's a very few number of systems where we can actually represent the system with a ball and basin model where we can actually put numbers on these things. But their point is that if you ask questions framed in terms of these three variables, then we can start making qualitative changes. Like we can say, if we plant shrubs in this particular area, then maybe we will affect the resistance to a particular phenomenon happening. If we make some other intervention, maybe we'll move the system back. Like we notice that the system is, the pond is very murky right now. Maybe if we do something that clears the pond out temporarily, we'll reduce the precariousness. It's not a long-term change like planting something, but it's a short-term change that brings the system back into a safer spot, reducing its precariousness. So, so that's kind of the idea here, is that these terms are meant to help guide you qualitatively, not meant to be something that you measure quantitatively and then take action based on what the current measurements are. So this hopefully was a review from thinking about ball and basin models from before the midterm. But are there any other questions about like these terms and this conceptualization of the ball and basin? those terms make sense. So we have these things, and then they also mentioned another important thing was panarchy. Which again were those linked adaptive cycles. And what they drew for that is basically imagine a ball and basin at one scale, and a ball and basin at another scale, and a ball and basin again at a higher scale, and these ball and basin models could interact with each other. And that's kind of the picture that I want you to have as well, is that the way panarchy plays in these ball and basin models is that, well, if we want to, I mean, remember that exogenous variables determine the shape of these basins. And the endogenous variables are the dimensions of the basins. So basically, you know, I said, well, maybe left and right, that left and right, maybe that is the clarity of the water. But the actual shape of these basins, whether it looks like this, or it looks like something else entirely, is determined by an exogenous variable, which is like, you know, which is keyed into different, so you can have like an exogenous variable would be phosphorus level in the soil. Well, at one phosphorus level in the soil, the clarity looks like this, but at another phosphorus level in the soil, the clarity looks like this. So if we assume that phosphorus level in the soil is constant, then we just have this basin. But in reality, the phosphorus level in the soil itself is changing over time. As farmers move in, as they do more things and whatever. So we could imagine at a higher scale, there's another set of dynamics where maybe actually phosphorus level in the soil for that system is an endogenous variable, which is changing relatively slowly, but in a predictable way over time. As more farmers move in, you get more phosphorus level in the soil, and so on and so forth. And so there is a basin of attraction that has to do with the amount of farming in the area. And endogenous level of variables at that system can be exogenous variables of this system. So as this system's moving around, unbeknownst to it, it's changing the shape of this system. And as this system changes, as the shape changes underneath this, this freshwater lake, then it may end up moving the freshwater lake into another basin of attraction, even though they weren't directly affecting the lake's water clarity or whatever. So because they had this impact by slowly shifting the exogenous variable, they changed the shape of the basin underneath the state of the lake. And that can cause the lake to start rolling towards a very different stable state. So that's the picture I want you to have with panarchy, is that there are dynamics happening on multiple scales: the leaf, the tree, the forest, the company, the market, the economy, the bottom of the lake itself, the system of lakes around where the farmers are. And dynamics happen in each one of these. It will not be tractable for us to build a model that includes all of these things simultaneously. So instead, what we do is we build a model at one scale, and we ask how changes in that model, which happen much more slowly, affect the shape of the dynamics in this model. And that model probably runs a lot faster, and we can ask again about how it affects this. And then likewise, we can bubble up the other direction. Say, as the lakes change, how is that going to affect the fertility of the soil, and so on and so forth. So there are interconnections between our models, but it's easier to model them as sort of separate models that periodically send messages to each other, as opposed to building a giant model that has a whole hell of a lot of parts. That's panarchy. Does that make sense? This idea that we break our world down into spatial and temporal scales so that we can sort of wrap our heads around each scale independently. But then when we want to make decisions and understand what's happening, you got to realize the real world is not 3 separate models. The real world is exchanging information and material across these things. So panarchy is the appreciation that changes at one scale can change parameters at another scale and vice versa. That makes sense. Any questions about that? Okay. All right, so with that in mind, what is adaptability? How does it sort of differ from just saying, we can say a system is adaptive, but when I look at a system, I'd say, that's not just an adaptive system, it's an adaptable system. What makes it adaptable? It's not just adaptive. Yeah.
Ability to absorb change.
Well, that's resilience. So that's a great definition for resilience, is its ability to absorb change. So if I were to look at this diagram here, a resilient system would have a large latitude, because if you perturb the system, you have to perturb it a whole lot to get it to go into another stable state. So it'll come back, it'll absorb that change. That's generally resilience. Adaptability is something a little more nuanced. Let me have a guess onto that. What's special about adaptability? Yeah.
There's different variables, but it keeps the same function.
Well, that's a different, okay, I like that. So that's one thing. I'm gonna put that down here as a note. So different variables, but same function. We expand on that. Maybe make it a little more general. Yeah.
I thought it was like when the actors in the system can have an effect on the system.
Yeah, right. So when actors in system or around system can create changes that increase resilience. I can tie these two things together to just say that when I look at a natural system, an ecological system, before I add the social part to it, the ecological system is going to have some levers in it. If I can find levers that I can leverage, that I can push on to increase, to basically look at its basins and say, wow, this is a really fragile system. But if I go in and I plant some bushes here, or I buffer, maybe I add a chemical buffer to the water, or I add some bass into the fishery, or I increase capacity of something. If I can make a small change, I will change the function of the system. That's the different variables part. I will change the players in the system, but it will provide the same function. So if I need it to be a freshwater fishery, if I need it to be a safe place for fish to thrive, then then even though I'm changing it a little bit, I'm still providing a habitat for those fish to thrive. And so that is an adaptable system, is a system that where the managers, it's really all about the human managers. So it is a manageable resistance or resilience. And so an adaptive system is a system which itself internally will respond to change. An adaptable system is a system that provides external managers in the overall social ecological system to be able to make changes to improve the resilience, basically to maintain the function beyond what the natural system could have done before. That's what we mean by adaptability. Are there questions about that? It's a key term. And that might also mean we want to adapt it to make change. Like, there might be a social system where we really want people to start recycling more, but they're locked into a stable state of not recycling. Well, if it's an adaptable system, then we could say, well, with a little bit of advertising, or maybe with some subsidies, or maybe with some other little thing that we can add, then we can change the basin of attraction for recycling compliance to make it much easier to get the state into that basin, where then it'll stay there from that point of time out. So sometimes we're trying to increase resilience, sometimes we're trying to decrease resilience. And so that's what I'm saying, it's really how manageable is the resilience so that we can move things away from a function we don't like, or in more of the case for adaptability, maintain the current function. So how can we maintain the function? That's adaptability. And then there's this alternative form of transformability. So what is the transformability of a system? This actually is more like, I really should have saved the recycling example for this. I think that's really what I was trying to get at. Yeah.
Is it when you completely change the function of the system, but you have the same goal?
What do you mean by goal?
Like output, I guess you could say,
Well,
for outcome.
Well, so in the case of transformability is sort of a last resort. This is like the case where they were talking about the Australian farmer who he was farming, I forget what he started with, but he ended up landing in a very different, like he's still using the land, but he now would participate in very different markets. So transformability is the ability to change a system for a new useful purpose. So when you are at the limits of adaptability, so you've hit the end, so adaptability, by the way, is, I'll write it up here, adaptability. Sometimes we also use the term adaptive capacity. And likewise, resilience, sometimes we use the term assimilative capacity, how much can you take on? Adaptive capacity is how much can we change the system to maintain the current function. But eventually it's going to get me to the point where it's like, no matter how many bushes I plant, no matter how much buffer I add, no matter how many fish I add, this pond is dead. There's nothing that I can do with it, but the old function is gone. But can I look at the system and say, what if I consider it for a different function? For a different function that is still useful to me, this actually has a lot of potential. So can I transform the system into something that serves a different purpose? So maybe it's not going to be a fishery anymore, but maybe it'll be a wetland for flood management or flood and drought management or something like that. So I've now gone from something that produces fish to something that provides another ecosystem service with very few changes as it would make that. It'll never be a fishery again, but now it provides a new value to me in the community and to the society. So it's the ability to generate new value. Ability to generate new value when the old value, when old function is not possible anymore. And so ideally, when we're looking at systems, we want to look for systems that have adaptability and transformability, because that provides us ways in which we can help manage resilience over time. So the transformability really has to do with how do we deal with that collapse. So maybe we can guide the release phase so that it will reorganize in a more useful system. So transformability, you can also think of that as sort of the ability to guide a reorganization in the adaptive cycle. All right, so any questions about that? That makes sense, the distinctions there, adaptability, transformability. All right, the only other things I want to mention are things that, again, a review from, if you remember back when we did the reading on predicting tipping points, predicting critical transitions, there was a paper that we read, which is sort of a primer on these phase transitions, and it talked about how there's two types of complex systems: the modular complex systems and the highly connected complex systems. And that's where we introduced this idea of general resilience, global resilience and local resilience. And so what we called before local resilience, we now have a term for that introduced by the book, specified or targeted resilience. And this is resilience to a specific disturbance or a known disturbance. And we know that if we optimize for one specified resilience, we might lose on another. And that suggests then that there could be a more generic resilience for any type of disturbance. And that's something that we called before global resilience. Which, does anybody remember the simple term that they used for this in the text? The sort of the flip side, you had specified or targeted resilience on one side, and what's the flip of that in the text? Yeah.
General resilience.
General resilience, that's right. And they mentioned that if you want general resilience, just generally, how do you structure your systems? When you're like, I have no idea what the threat is going to be. And so how do I build my system, my Google or whatever, to try to stave off any future threat, even when I don't know what that threat is? And I said there are three things you can do to try to make your system have general resilience. And one of them is to increase its diversity. And that could be both functional diversity and response diversity, with maybe an emphasis on response, where functional diversity is diversity in the functions you provide. Response diversity is diversity in how different components of your system respond when given the same disturbance. So some might respond, like some really need access to a resource. If that resource goes away, they're out, but others don't depend on that resource as much. And so if you have response diversity, then if you lose that resource, you'll still have redundancies. And so the idea here is to maximize redundancies. And just remember, that's at cost. It costs a lot to have redundancies. The other thing is modularity. And that is sort of the flip side of connectedness. Connectedness. So a highly connected system where every individual is involved with every other individual. So if every individual depends on every other individual, then if any one of those individuals fails, then it affects every other individual in the system. So if you have modularity, then you can localize failures so that the rest of the system continue to function, albeit at a degraded state. And then the last thing was tightness of feedbacks. And I will just relate this to delays. So the idea here is if you do have a response to a disturbance, you probably want to minimize delays in how you respond to that disturbance. So they mentioned central government introduces a lot of delays. If there is a problem here, like, oh, there's a fire in this room, if the only way I can get this fire out is for me to call Washington, D.C. to have them dispatch somebody, then this building's just going to burn down. But if I have local response, so if I can very quickly call ASU and and the ASU fire department is able to immediately come out here, then there's a greater chance that we can save the building. So that's what I mean by tightness of feedbacks is to try to put the detection of the response or detection of the disturbance close to the response. And if you do that, you can get general or global resilience. And if you can think back to when we read that first paper where we introduced this local and global idea, then if you remember, they had like a stressor on one axis, and they had like the system response on the other. And they talked about for local resilience, it would be like flat, but then you jump to a totally different state. But for general resilience, then you get sort of, with an increase in the stressor, the system would have a noticeable change, but there would never be these giant regime shifts. And that's exactly what they're talking about here. With modular systems, you get a slight degradation, but the system kind of stays close to where it was before. And that's true that with the local resilience, if there's a disturbance that you expect, the system doesn't change at all. But if there is a disturbance greater than what you expect, the system totally breaks down. And that's what we're trying to do. All right, so 1:15, I don't want to keep it any longer. If any other questions on that, feel free to come up. Attendance slide here is what is another name for specified or targeted resilience? If you go back to the terms we were using before the midterm, we used the previous term for specified or targeted resilience and called it another type of resilience. What was that term that we used? I just was talking about on the previous slide. Otherwise, all I've got for you, don't forget the critical thing, those project proposals due this weekend. I'm really looking forward to reading those. Otherwise, have a good weekend.
Yes.